You are joining us live from wintry Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. I'm Chris Wofford, and I'm excited to welcome Cornell Law's Celia Biggines to the studio once again. Celia, thanks for coming back.
Great, Chris. Thanks. It's always a pleasure. Good to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. Celia is a Keynotes alum, as I just mentioned, and among my favorite guests. She is faculty author of Cornell's online certificate program in corporate governance. We'll share the URL if you are interested in further education on the topic that we're going to be covering today and everything that our topic ends up touching in the end. At the law school, Celia is clinical professor of law and founder of the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. What do you do at the Law Clinic? What are the objectives? What do you work on?
Sure. So for anybody who's not familiar with law clinics, they're essentially like a teaching hospital. The idea is to take law students who have not yet graduated, haven't passed the bar, but want some real life hands-on experience working with a client. The idea is to teach real life skills for the students while allowing the students to use their time and law school resources to provide services to those who might not otherwise be able to access them. So we represent small businesses and entrepreneurs around Ithaca, some affiliated with Cornell, some who are not, and providing a variety of transactional services. So you want to start a business, you want to hire people, you want to trademark your brand, you want to hire somebody who's an immigrant, for example, doesn't have work authorization. Those are the types of questions that come to us, and we're really there to provide pro bono legal services to small businesses that can't access them, but really need to tackle legal questions before they can take their next stage in their life.
I don't want to take a creative flood of incoming, but like among our audience members, who can access the services at the Law Clinic?
Well, it's really available to anybody in the Ithaca area. You know, we serve for-profit businesses, nonprofit businesses. Our criteria are, if you can afford a lawyer, then we would rather that you pay for your legal services. We're really trying to find entrepreneurs and small business owners who otherwise would not have access to a lawyer, really need it.
Got it. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for that. And we'll share I think we have a URL for that. Hopefully we'll share that in the chat. Okay, viewers, a couple notes really quickly. This event is live right now. It's being recorded, and it will be viewable at the same URL afterward, right? So if you have to leave early or you want to share this with colleagues or friends, this is the URL to watch not only the show right now, but of course the recording, which will be available shortly after we're through today. Celia and I have a lot to talk about, but we're very much interested in what you have to say, so you may submit questions in the chat, which you may open by clicking the dialog box at the top right of your video player. If you're having trouble with volume, it's next to the closed captioned button below. We'll be asking you a few poll questions, which you may launch by shooting this QR code with your smartphone. We'll kick up that QR code and get ready to use this because we have several interactive elements that are coming your way. Throughout the discussion, we will be sharing URLs and resources. Celia has provided us with a lot, so through the conversation, you'll hear an item being discussed and the URL that corresponds with it, articles, resources, papers, etc. Will be shared in the chat as well, so they will be coming pretty fast. I will say that if you are watching the archived recording, those links will no longer appear in the chat because the chat is gone. It's not live. So those links will be available in the overview section just below. So if you're watching the recording, you hear us mention something, the link is probably in the overview section just below. Okay, here we go. Get your smartphones ready. We are going to enter the little interactive segment here. First question is, where are you joining us from? Right, so we'll ask our audience. Celia, I'll tell you that we invariably get international audiences. Great. I know that a lot of what we're discussing today has a lot to do with domestic concerns and American, U.S. legal frameworks and so on. But a lot of what we are talking about perhaps presumably applies internationally as well.
Absolutely. A lot of countries have somewhat similar models, somewhat similar legal structures. And also, I think it's really interesting to take an international approach to say, all right, we have this corporate legal structure in the U.S. Why? How does it compare to what some other countries are doing? You know, are they doing it differently from us? And if so, are there things that we can learn? So,
yeah, you bet. We're going to interject while we wait for the responses to come in. We're going to play around with the script and flip the script a little bit. If you've seen past keynotes, you may have seen a segment called What Did You Bring? And in the What Did You Bring segment, I usually ask my guests to bring something that helps them either personally or professionally in their work, something that helps them do their job better or enhances their life in some way. Celia, what did you bring today?
Well, so this is Molly.
Wow,
Molly we are calling her the chief fiduciary doodle because we're going to be talking
Definitely
about
is.
fiduciary duties today.
Yeah.
She's otherwise my top paralegal and often a teaching assistant.
Sure.
So Molly is 10 years old, so she has seen all sorts of changes in the law over the last decade. Prepared
Yes.
to talk about that.
Yeah.
But on a serious note, Molly, she's a good girl, as you can see. And, one of my jobs is, as I said, I'm a lawyer, I'm also a teacher. And Molly has honestly quite close relationships with a lot of my students. I have a couple students who are studying for the bar exam right now. They're taking it in 2 weeks. And Molly has been almost single-handedly getting them through it, providing emotional support. So.
Perfect. And I heard Molly was a Zoom star during deep COVID when you were teaching your classes, right?
Absolutely. She was usually pretty much right here. So, yes. And even now, whenever we're doing Zooms, she's often there. One of my clients in the entrepreneurship clinic it's a veterinary business. And so if ever Molly is not on our Zoom meetings, they get quite perturbed. So.
Perfect. Thank you for bringing Molly. She's going to hang out for the remainder if everybody doesn't mind. Let's talk a little bit about who's in our audience today. Molly, do whatever you please. Looks like we have Ithaca representing very strongly. Love to
Great.
see it. Poughkeepsie showing up. Jersey and Florida also showing up. Internationally, we have some people from Mexico City. We have Ottawa. Where else? Finland, Manila, Maricopa County, presumably. There we go. So we have people from all over the place. Marriott International HQ. There you go. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Good to get a sense of who's with us today. We have a couple more follow-up questions. Let's go to question 2, please. This is a kind of a trick question. We'll find out. Are you a shareholder at a corporation? So please tell us that. Should we talk about definition of shareholder yet, or how do you want to do this?
Well, so I put this in. This is a little bit of a trick question.
Okay.
You would think it's an easy yes or no.
Right.
But I'll ask you before you answer the question, for those of you who haven't answered it yet.
Yes.
Do you have a 401k or a money management account? Any sort of a savings account that is not just pure cash? In that case, maybe consider your answer carefully.
Okay, so we're seeing the answers come in. Moments ago, we were at a solid like 70% no. The yes is only at about 29. We have 5% who are unsure. I knew that was going to be a thing. That's why I included. So, okay, everybody's getting wise to where their money is and what their status is within that organization. So we have so let's just call it about split,
changing.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So we have a yes and no. I don't know. How do you usually see the answers to these questions? Does this kind of line up with what you typically see?
Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
okay.
It is fairly typical, I would imagine. It's different if we're talking to students, for example, as compared to people who are already in the workplace, that sort of thing. But yeah, this is about what I would see. So why it was a trick question? We were talking about money management accounts. Do you have a 401k? We'll talk about the main decision makers within a corporation, and each of their areas of authority and rights and responsibilities. Shareholding is an interesting one. Yes, I am a shareholder in lots of companies, I believe, but I'm not buying shares in those companies so that I can go to their annual meeting and vote, influence their decision making.
Yeah.
I have a money management account and I've got a 401k through Cornell, and they're invested in a whole bunch of equity and debt securities. So sure, I'm a shareholder. I don't know what companies I'm a shareholder in, and I'm trusting more experienced professionals to manage those companies for me and hopefully, allow my 401k to grow.
You don't read every message that comes to your email from your financial management group?
Yes, I do.
I'm sure
Definitely,
you do.
Chris.
All right, let's go to the next question here. This is a really important question. Have you ever been to Delaware? Celia, why are you asking this question? What's going on?
I love
here?
Delaware.
Yeah.
I actually don't think I have ever been to Delaware.
Oh,
I have driven
okay.
through it, perhaps. I
right.
don't think I've ever set foot in the state of Delaware.
Yep.
But, as some of you may know, Delaware is really the heart of corporate law in America.
Yep.
So Delaware is where it's sort of the oldest, most well-established, most predictable, clear, and most attractive set of corporate laws in the U.S. So not all corporations in the U.S. are incorporated in Delaware, of course. Mm-hmm. Many of them are. I think about 2/3 of the Fortune 500 are incorporated in Delaware. But most importantly, Delaware is a leader in this space. So when Delaware innovates, other states are likely to see what Delaware is doing and follow their model.
So that's kind of how it goes, right? I mean, is there any questioning this model, or is there any reason to disrupt it, or?
I mean, if you ask California and Nevada, sure, they would say there's lots of reasons. Come to us.
Right.
And you see there's areas, we're not going to be talking about them today, but certain areas like data privacy and cybersecurity laws.
Yeah.
There are certain states, California and Nevada I just mentioned, that are really trying to get ahead of Delaware and show that they can be the leaders in this area. That being said, no, I think by and large, Delaware has its spot, and it's not it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's look at our results. So we have 69% of our audience having been to Delaware. We saw that
Impressive.
Jersey and Pennsylvania represented pretty strong. So,
Yeah.
they probably ended up there. Anybody that's gone down Route 95
Yep.
has presumably driven through Wilmington and so on.
Yes.
Okay, enough of Delaware. Let's cut into it. Let's talk a little bit about the corporate structure, roles, responsibilities within that structure. Give us the big picture of what we're talking about here,
Sure.
Celia.
Sure. So corporations, the corporate structure is established as a way really to promote innovation, promote business, while protecting individuals from personal liability for their business activities. So what we mean by that is, Chris, let's say you and I wanted to start an ice cream business here in Ithaca. I could put in a second mortgage on my house. You could maybe contribute some of your savings. We could go all in together. A year from now, the business isn't doing so well. We might see all of our personal investments having disappeared. Then we might have creditors coming to us saying, hey, Chris, you still owe us money on that business loan. You're going to have to sell your house now, right? That's an extreme example. But in that case, if that were the case, you and I, we probably wouldn't go into the ice cream business in the first place.
Yep.
However, if we could say, let's set up a corporation, we're going to name it Chris and Celia Ice Cream Co., and we're going to, contribute a little bit of capital, but otherwise that corporation is going to be entirely separate from us. We go under, the lenders can't come after us or any of our assets. They can't claim they can't claim my house. They couldn't claim Molly, right?
Yeah.
So that is the purpose behind the corporate form. So the corporation stands as it's a separate taxpayer. It's a separate legal entity. It has its own assets and liabilities, and there are going to be various stakeholders in that corporation, individuals in different roles. We'll talk about them today, but they stand separately and apart from the company.
Can we call it C&C Ice Cream Factory?
I think we can, but I got to be the first C.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, cool.
All right. So who are typically like the key stakeholders? This includes like oversight units,
Yep.
Boards,
Yep.
etc. So
Yep.
tell us how that
Absolutely.
stacks up.
So there's really three main groups that we'll talk about, and we're thinking about the shareholders, the board of directors, and management. Now, this can seem overly formalistic, and I will tell you, for many of my clients in the entrepreneurship clinic that are small businesses, usually you get a couple people, you and I, with the CNC Ice Cream Factory. We might be the founders, the only shareholders, the only directors, and we're going to run the company ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. It's as the company grows that there's a need for sort of experienced business leadership, and B, we want to make sure that there are clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and we're minimizing the risks of any conflict of interest between the individuals involved in the company and the company's best interests. Right. So that's why we have these three groups.
Sure, right.
So shareholders. Those of you who, answered, yes, you're a shareholder, you might be an active shareholder, you might be running your own business, you might be voting, or you might just be like me as a passive shareholder. Either way, you have an ownership interest in the company. You do have a right to weigh in on big picture decisions. You're usually not involved on a day-to-day basis. And most importantly, for many people, you have an economic right to share in the profits of that company. Board of directors is kind of the next level down. The board of directors are appointed by the shareholders. Their role is to really oversee big picture strategy. Again, usually the directors are not operating on a day-to-day basis, making decisions about, should we add a new ice cream flavor tomorrow?
They have quarterly check-ins and so
Exactly.
on. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then management are the individuals chosen by the board of directors to run the company on a day-to-day basis. So, CEO, CFO, general counsel, whoever it might be, right? These are individuals chosen for their areas of expertise. They are the day-to-day managers. And so their responsibility is to make sure that they are implementing the broad level directives they're getting from the directors and ultimately the shareholders.
So you had some examples in Apple and
Yeah.
Theranos. Tell me a little bit about those and shareholders, boards, and how that, what sort of shook out with Theranos.
Sure.
And the Apple situation as well.
Sure. Yeah, so, we're talking about some real world examples just to kind of show as a practical matter how do these three groups function.
Yeah.
So, Theranos, obviously, I would imagine most of our viewers are familiar with this story. One of the issues that came to the fore when Theranos really started to unravel was that Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, her sort of number two, had put together a pretty impressive board of directors of luminaries from their fields. George Shultz is sort of usually the most well-known example. That being said, what was remarkable was that nobody on the board of this sophisticated biomedical company had any form of pharmaceutical or medical experience.
And this appeared to be by design.
Exactly.
Okay.
Appeared to be by design, and what it meant was you take these individuals and without ascribing any ill intent to them or any neglect to them, you could say they were working hard and doing their jobs. They simply did not have the experience or expertise to really understand what was going on in the company and to be able to anticipate the issues that would arise with Theranos. If I was asked to be on the board of Theranos, I'd be flattered, but I wouldn't have a clue how to begin to advise a sophisticated medical company, right? So now in the Theranos story is an interesting one for companies to think about when they're thinking about who to appoint to their board of directors.
Yes.
Your board doesn't necessarily all have to be industry specialists. You might have somebody on your board who's really good at fundraising, somebody who's, there to lend credibility. That being said, the board has, and we're going to talk about this, a fiduciary duty towards the company to act in the best interest of the company. How can the board do that if they can't really understand the company's business or its industry?
Can I ask you a quick question about
Yeah.
that? So we're jumping a little bit ahead as far as the fiduciary theory kind of stuff, but does the company itself operationally, right? We're talking about Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny.
Yeah.
Also have a fiduciary duty to report the goings on to the board.
Yeah.
In a way that they may not have.
Right. That's a really interesting question. So, and the answer now is different from what it would have been, say, in the 60s, 70s, and we'll talk about some of the evolution of this corporate law.
Yeah.
But, so there was a landmark case in the 60s that really addressed this question of, A, how active do directors need to be in soliciting information from, the Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny, and how proactive do Elizabeth and Sunny need to be in informing their directors to enable them to make informed decisions. So up until the 60s, the idea had been, you and I, we could be on the board, we could walk into a meeting, we could read the materials that have been presented to us, and we could give our opinions and our thoughts. But there was an ability to either intentionally sort of stick your head in the sand and ignore the hard questions, or just kind of say, this all looks good, right? But in this landmark case, this Caremark case that came out of Delaware, the Delaware Chancery Court said, no, directors, if you are going to be authorized by this company's owners, the shareholders, to manage for the shareholders, maximize their profits, and act in their best interests, no, you need to do your homework. You need to read materials that are given to you. You need to ask informed questions. Where you see red flags or areas of uncertainty, you need to probe. So the idea is you cannot stick your head in the sand. You cannot claim willful ignorance. You need to be active. So Elizabeth and Sunny had an obligation to enable their directors to fulfill that duty. They need to provide them with the right information. So by whether it was intentional or not that they stacked their board with very accomplished people without industry expertise, they were setting up their directors for failure because the directors very likely were not equipped to provide the level of strategic oversight that company needed.
So when we talk about stakeholders, employees have a stake in this.
Absolutely.
Customers, in many cases, have a stake. How do they fit into the framework?
Sure. So when I talked about the three groups, the shareholders, directors, and management, those are really the three groups with decision-making authority within a company.
Yeah.
Right? But yes, the company, it owes obligations to a variety of constituencies. So employees are one of them. There has been a growth in recent years of companies that are looking to serve their employee constituency in a variety of ways, whether it's by giving ownership stakes to employees, increasing wages above the minimum wage to enable their employees to really improve their lives and move up within the organization. Customers are a constituency. Some might argue that the environment is a constituency.
Right, which comes up a little bit later in our conversation.
Exactly. Exactly. So this is all going back to your original question, what is a corporation? What is its structure?
Yeah.
Traditionally, there had been a concept that a corporation was essentially a model to enable its shareholders to maximize their profits. And that was a very narrow view. It was narrow, functional, it was well defined, it was kind of easy to implement to a certain extent. Now, what we're seeing in our society and in the corporate laws is an evolving, broader, maybe somewhat messy or more complicated, but potentially a deeper view of what a corporation is and what constituencies it serves. And there doesn't necessarily have to be the same model.
Yeah.
Some corporations might choose to prioritize constituencies that others wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay, good. Forgive me if I'm messing this up, but stakeholders, the role of stakeholders
Sure.
in establishing a board, right? Voting, presumably to put that board together. Functionally, what else? What other kind of role did they take in the as it relates to the corporation?
So the shareholders, as the owners of the corporation, again, they can be extremely actively involved in management.
Yeah.
So again, with my small business clients, the shareholders, say you and I are going 50-50 in on our business. If I'm a 50% owner, I'm probably going to want some decent level of oversight, and I'm going to want to vote on decisions because I have such a high stake in this company.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
The lower my ownership percentage goes, then the more likely it is that I'm going to be willing to delegate to others, right, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
So, so in a large corporation, the sort of Fortune 500 companies that we see, very often the shareholders are not actively involved in decision
How many can there
making.
be?
But the shareholders,
Yeah,
I
I don't
mean,
know.
in theory, so a publicly listed company, that's
Yeah.
the beauty of it. You could, it's almost infinite, right? You
Yeah.
can divide up shares of the pie into as tiny fractions as you want, right?
Yeah.
So there can be masses of shareholders. Some of them could be institutional, like retirement funds,
Yes.
individuals.
Right.
We have shareholders around the world. So, chances are some of our international viewers may own shares in U.S. corporations, right?
Sure.
But so usually the model for a public multinational corporation is shareholders are somewhat divorced from day-to-day decision making. But you and I were talking before this show. There are examples where there is not the case, and I think those might become more frequent. So we were talking about
do you
Apple,
mean? Yeah.
for example,
Yep.
right? So Apple's shareholders in the past couple of years have made headlines by asserting their ownership rights, and I don't mean their economic rights, I mean their rights to weigh in on company decision making and influence the board and demand accountability from the board and management. They've done this in a way that is really quite rare for a publicly listed company, massive company like Apple.
Yeah.
So, Apple has had some issues, as many people know. A couple of them came to the fore in recent years, one around Apple's labor practices,
Yeah.
particularly internationally, right?
Yeah.
So
Manufacturing in Asia.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So Apple's shareholders said, this is not acceptable to us.
Yeah.
We want a reckoning with the board and with management to know what you're doing about this, what you knew, what fell through the cracks, and what you're going to do to change, right?
Sure.
And there's been somewhat the same movement within Apple's shareholders about how Apple treats its employees more generally, but particularly around human rights and workforce.
Yeah.
So what Apple's shareholders were able to do, and this is not all of them, but it's a minority, but a sizable enough minority, is they were able to overcome this collective action problem where you've got millions of dispersed shareholders.
Okay.
They were able to come together and say, look, this is an issue that is sufficiently important to this broad group of people that we're going to go to the board, we're going to go to management, and we're going to say, all right, we want to force you to address questions that you don't want to address. So
Yeah.
Apple's annual meeting, this item had to be on the agenda to talk about what are we going to do to improve our practices and make sure that we are not engaging in further human rights violations. It's why I say I think it might happen more frequently is it's going back to this broader point about what is the purpose of a corporation. If
Yeah.
we accept, as some do now, that the purpose of a for-profit corporation has to be broader than just maximizing profits, then there's going to be debates about, okay, well, then who do we serve? Are we going to be seeking to improve our environmental record, even if it means increasing our production costs, right? Even if it means cutting dividend checks so that we can be better corporate citizens. There are going to be debates about these things. And because they really get to the heart of what this company is and what it's about, shareholders inevitably are going to be involved in those debates.
So, do corporate laws influence how a company distributes authority among owners, directors, execs? how does that? I just
Yeah.
think that's kind of fascinating.
It is.
It kind of guides your decision making and how you strategically want to structure your company.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of a default set of rules, and then
Yeah.
companies can choose to deviate from that default to a certain extent, depending on, again, the company structure, the company size, who is involved. So in a small company, the shareholders might get together and say, all right, here's a list of the 12 major decisions that we want to weigh in on if these were to happen. Whether it's, you can think of things like, a change of control or declaring bankruptcy. Those are obvious. But the shareholders might say, look, Chris, if you want to sell your shares in the company, I want to have a say in that, right? Or if we're going to expand beyond ice cream and start making soda, we want to have a say in it. But in a totally different set of shareholders, say it's, a business you and I are in together, and we've decided we really just are in this for the economic profits. We're not really interested in, in necessarily the day-to-day of the business.
Yeah.
Our shareholder agreement might be very different, and we might say, no, we don't need to be involved unless you're declaring bankruptcy or changing the name of the business, right?
Yeah.
Other than that, we'll sit back, we'll delegate to management.
Yeah.
So there are best practices, and those best practices can be varied and customized depending on both what the company is and who is involved. But yes, generally speaking, corporate laws say you have your owners, they have ultimate decision-making authority. Under the law, the owners have to appoint the directors. The directors can't be appointed by anybody else. And under the law, the directors then appoint their management and delegate roles and responsibilities to management. So again, shareholders cannot abdicate their duty to appoint directors. They can be more or less involved in assessing the directors, but that's sort of the basic structure. Within there, how directors vote, how frequent the communication needs to be between management and directors, how frequent the communication is from directors to shareholders. There is some wiggle room and some room to customize based on what works best for that company structure.
Perfect. I'm going to take an audience question because
Yeah.
a really good one came in from Andrea.
Okay.
Do responsibilities evolve with different levels of management or officerhood for employees within a corporation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So, let's take a corporation that has CEO, a chief financial officer, and a general counsel. And then each of those individuals has teams working beneath them. So the CEO obviously is going to have broad level oversight. We might say, all right, CEO, you are authorized to sign contracts on behalf of the company. But we might say, CFO and GC, you're not authorized to sign contracts on behalf of the company. You have more siloed areas of responsibility.
Yeah.
You're managing the finances, you're managing the legal operations, right? That's sort of a somewhat extreme example, but that's to say, yes, you can take different levels of management, different individuals, and give them their own silos of rights, responsibilities, and what they are allowed to do, right? You can have broad authority spread out among the management levels, or you can really choose to take the case of Elizabeth and Sonny, keep authority very, very tightly limited to a small group of individuals. And questions like this are going to be partly operational and what is most efficient, what works best for the company, partly big picture, sort of thinking, all right, well, how participatory do we want governance and decision making to be in our company? There's trade-offs between participation and efficiency, right? But there are also, you go for optimal efficiency, minimal participation, you could risk something along the lines of the Theranos story.
Thank you, Andrea, for that question.
Yeah.
Celia, in your work with the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic, do you ever deal with non-competes? Is this something that comes up? Do you want to talk about this today?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
I'll tell you why. Because Melissa asks, can you comment on the FTC review of corporate non-competes?
Yep.
What's up?
That's great. Great question. In fact, we were just talking about it in my class a couple of weeks ago at the start of the semester.
All right.
So for those of you who are not familiar with this, the FTC came out with a proposal, it's in January, either late December or January, to say that on a federal level, the FTC wants to prohibit the use of non-competes.
That would be
broadly
huge.
speaking. It would be transformational in
Yeah.
a lot of industries.
Yep.
So, non-competes, we do deal with them. And there is no uniform type of non-compete. There also is no uniform law in the U.S. thus far on non-competes. So California doesn't recognize non-competes, which is, interesting. We can think of California as sort of the foundation of our tech economy. But thus far, the tech giants in California, they've managed to grow just fine without the use of non-competes. New York, where we're based, where we see this with some of our clients, New York will recognize a non-compete as long as it's reasonable. It can't be, I'm not allowed to practice law anywhere in the world for the rest of my life if I leave Cornell, right? That would not be a fair non-compete. A non-compete that's, limited geographically in scope, limited to 6 or 9 months or a year, that might be recognized by a court. Now, that being said, and this is deviating a little bit from our topic, but sort of my approach as a corporate lawyer is generally, if somebody signs a non-compete, where this would come up in my clinic usually is we have a client that wants to hire an individual to come work with them. That individual has a non-compete from a prior employer. So our client might come to us and say, can you take a look at their non-compete and let us know if we can hire them? We've had cases where we take a look at that non-compete and say, it is so overly broad, it is ludicrous. If this were to go to court, a court would throw it out.
I see, yeah.
That being said, my answer to the client is not always, sure, go ahead and hire this person.
Yes.
Because you now are in a position of having to go to court, having to defend, having to work with a larger company, or work against a larger company that had that non-compete signed up, right?
Yeah.
So their non-competes to have some legal significance. They also, though, I think play a large part in influencing the risks that employers are willing to take in hiring certain individuals. Right.
Nice one. Thank you, Melissa, for that. Mohammed's got us stretching out a little bit. Can suppliers be shareholders via debt conversion in the U.S. regulatory environment?
Wow. That's a specific one.
Very.
Via debt conversion. Absolutely, you can. Absolutely.
Explain to me what's going on here.
All right. So in a corporation, basics of corporate finance is a corporation is composed of debt and equity, right? And there's lots of flavors in there. So in equity, you could have the regular common shares that everyday shareholders will own. There could be preferred shares. There's all sorts of flavors within there. The idea is, though, debt. If I loan a company $100 and I say, this is $100, bears 10% interest, and it's due in 2 years, it's very clear. I have the right to get back my $100 and the 10% interest. I don't have a right to get back anything else from the company. I'm not going to share in profits if the company does well, but I have that fixed claim. And if the company goes bankrupt, I get to take my note to the bankruptcy trustee and say, look, this is the $100 plus interest that I'm owed. Yeah. That is debt. The equity piece, and the shareholders, this is the group we've been talking about, shareholders are going to pay, say I'll pay $100 for shares in Apple. I own those shares. If Apple does really well, I could potentially be, buying a house or buying a yacht, whatever it might be. I'm sharing in the upside.
Yep.
Or Apple goes under and I lose my $100 that I've invested. So at the end of the day, Apple goes under. The creditors who loaned money are going to be paid out first. If there's anything left for the shareholders, they're paid out second. So they're lower in priority to the creditors, but they get the chance to share in the upside. So I think what Mohammed is talking about with his question here is a company could be buying from a supplier, a vendor. So let's take our ice cream company. We're buying, milk and butter from a supplier. We may not be able to pay in cash. We may owe them a debt. And we could say, all right, let's strike a deal. Instead of paying you back the $1,000 that we owe for last year's milk and butter, let's give you 5% of our company. Do you think that's fair? And this is purely just a matter of private contract as between us and our supplier. If they want to take it, they want to take equity instead of cash. They're choosing to take more of a risk, but potentially get more upside. There's nothing wrong with that.
Is this a frequent arrangement? Is this prevalent? Is this how things generally work, or is this specific to certain scenarios? It's
specific to certain scenarios.
Okay.
So for my clients, startup clients, they generally don't have any cash. So in a startup, it's very common that a startup will acquire people with equity, and by that I mean they might hire initial talent with equity.
Sure.
And very often, you might go to a supplier and say, look, I really love this product that you have. I want to make it the centerpiece of my new offering, but I can't pay you right now. Will you take take 10% share in the upside. Right? That's a risk, but that's essentially equity is really often the only asset that a startup has to offer.
Sure.
As a company grows and as its contractual relationships develop, it's less likely that it's going to be giving out equity.
Yeah.
But there's still circumstances in which it happens. Right?
Great. I like that. Thank you, Mohammed. I hate to pick favorites, but that's my favorite question so far.
All right.
I don't know.
Well done, Mohammed.
Yeah. I have a question here from Faten Glenn, who asks, are there different laws for an LLC versus incorporated establishment?
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up. And
Okay.
I wanted to mention at the beginning. So yes, we have several entity types in the U.S., and a lot of countries follow this model. So corporation we're talking about because it's for large companies, at least, it is sort of the gold standard. The corporation is a structure that facilitates widespread ownership, that allows individuals to sell shares, to freely transfer their equity. And a corporation is really the easiest model to bring in outside investors for a company that really needs outside capital. So we're focusing on a corporation because it's the most common. That being said, a corporation was not the original. So the sort of the original business structure in the U.S. is simply a partnership. You and I get together and say, let's start our ice cream company. We're going to go in 50-50. We're going to own it, and we get to share in the revenues and the losses 50-50. That's a relatively simple structure. There are limited liability companies, which are to a certain extent a nice hybrid where they offer some of the liability protection of a corporation, but some of the partnership aspects that you would see in a traditional old form partnership. And then there's a whole variety of other flavors now. There's limited liability partnerships, there's limited partnerships, there's benefit corporations that we can talk about. So yes, there are different laws governing all of these entity types. The main difference among them is really how they are taxed, but there are different laws governing them. But the general principles that we are talking about in terms of taking a business entity, identifying the individuals within that entity who are allowed to make decisions for that entity and the rules that they need to abide by when they're making those decisions, that general structure applies at any entity type that we're looking at. So.
Thank you for the question, Faten Glenn.
Yeah.
Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Molly the dog as chief fiduciary officer. How might Molly define the term fiduciary? We've been throwing it around. We actually haven't dug deep into what it means within everything we've just described here. So what does Molly, chief fiduciary officer, concern herself with?
Absolutely.
Primarily?
So fiduciary, when we talk about fiduciary duty, it's a term that probably most people have heard of, but at its essence, we've got to figure out what it is, right?
Yep.
And generally speaking, fiduciary is used in many areas of the law, not just in corporate law. But the idea is if I am authorized by somebody else to act for them and in their best interests, that means I am a fiduciary. So, you see this in a variety of ways. If you have a financial advisor, you're saying, I'm going to give you, my savings, my 401k, and I'm going to say your job is to use your skills, do what you do best, but you are acting in my interests, right?
Yes.
To grow my 401k and protect me in retirement and protect my family. That financial advisor has a fiduciary duty to me. So that's what we're talking about generally. So my fiduciary duties to Molly are to love her and pet her at all times and feed her and give her shots and, protect her.
Sure.
So in the corporate context, fiduciary duties are really the tie between the corporation, this fictional legal person that pays his own taxes, and the individuals that direct the corporation and that control the ship. So there's two main fiduciary duties, and these are really the duties that obligate directors and officers, the individuals who are making daily decisions, but doing it for the company and for its shareholders. So two main duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. So sound pretty simple, but we really have to think about, all right, well, what does care actually mean?
Or
and
loyalty.
How careful do you have to be? Right, exactly.
Yeah, yep.
So the duty of care, we touched upon that one earlier when I was talking about the 1960s case in which the Delaware court said, no, directors, you have to do your homework. You can't stick your head in the sand. You need to actually educate yourself about this company that you're running, right? That's the duty of care. And so a lot of the law that has evolved around the duty of care goes into, how much preparation do directors need to do? Again, how much information do they need? That type of thing. And then the duty of loyalty is an interesting one because let's go back to our Apple example. Any individual who is on the board of directors at Apple chances are might be on the boards of several other companies, might be actively managing their, several other companies. Certainly going to have personal assets at stake in a variety of companies and industries. So how can they be loyal to Apple while having significant economic and professional and business interests in a variety of other companies? So again, the law in this area has evolved to say, all right, what does loyalty actually mean? At its most basic, it means not making decisions in your capacity as a corporate director that are really intended to benefit you as an individual, right? Sort of avoiding that general conflict of interest.
Yep.
But there's a lot of permutations within that on saying, what is a conflict of interest, when does it exist, and how does a director have to act when faced with one?
We have a question from an audience member who submitted via Slido. Thanks for this one, anonymous viewer. Boards do not share all information with shareholders, for example, upcoming mergers or strategic changes within the organization. How much are they expected or obligated to divulge, given everything you've just said?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it will vary depending on whether the company is publicly listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, or if it's a private company, in which case sort of the disclosure between directors and shareholders is often very much just a matter of contract, so private law.
Yeah.
So to take the public company example, here we're really looking at the intersection of sort of the Delaware corporate laws that lay out these different stakeholder groups and what they're allowed to do, and the securities laws, because the securities laws are in place to protect the everyday mom and pop investors like us who might own shares in Apple, but we aren't equipped to ask the right questions. We don't have a direct relationship with the board of directors of Apple, but we have an economic stake. So the securities laws are going to force a lot more disclosure in that context. Generally speaking, though, to answer this question, you got to think about what are the shareholders authorized to vote on. And this is going to be laid out in a company's bylaws.
Yeah.
So the Delaware corporate laws will say, yes, shareholders have to vote on the election of directors. They can't delegate to anybody else. They can't say, hey, directors, you guys can, you can elect yourselves. No, shareholders weigh in on that. Shareholders would have to vote on a company declaring bankruptcy. Shareholders would have to vote on a company being acquired, a change of control.
Yep.
Below that level, the company, in its bylaws, its rule book, can say we're going to set aside a whole host of other decisions that shareholders are authorized to act on or not authorized to act on. So that rule book, in laying out the shareholders' responsibilities and rights, is going to dictate in turn what information directors need to provide to shareholders, right? So if we have a set of bylaws that have a very restrictive set of issues and questions that shareholders are allowed to vote on, the directors might feel entitled to provide less information, as opposed to if we have shareholders that are going to be voting on a dozen matters at any given annual meeting, the directors might need to provide much more fulsome information, whether it's operational, financial, strategic, right, to enable the shareholders to make an informed decision.
Slight turn here.
Yeah.
So does the law help a corporate fiduciary figure out how to actually follow their duty?
Yeah.
Is it clear?
That's a great question. It is. I will give you the lawyerly answer, in that I will say it depends.
It always does.
Exactly. So there are some circumstances in which the fact pattern lead to a clear legal answer. So I'll give you an example. So let's say again, you and I, Chris, are on the board of an apple cider company here in Ithaca. We've got all sorts of apple farms.
We have in our notes as a restaurant example.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's do the restaurant. Okay.
We're still C&C.
Yeah, exactly. So we're on the board of this restaurant.
Yep.
So you, Chris, might own another restaurant. Say you own a restaurant in Watkins Glen,
Okay.
right? Which is just down the street from
10
us here in
miles away.
Ithaca. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. So you are going to be privy to potentially confidential information from that restaurant in Watkins Glen, and you're going to be privy to confidential information from our restaurant here in Ithaca.
Okay.
Your Watkins Glen restaurant might want to open a branch in Ithaca, and it's going to be down the street from our restaurant here. It's going to be directly competing, right? Our restaurant here in Ithaca is thinking about, do we expand? What are our next steps going to be? You, Chris, are in a position where you're holding confidential information and you stand to benefit economically from this Watkins Glen competitor.
Yeah.
What are you going to be able to do in this situation, right? This is where the fiduciary duties of loyalty and care really, really come to the forefront. Now, let's say, though, we're in a situation where, again, you and I are on the board of directors of this restaurant, and we have a disagreement. I think what we should be doing is jacking up prices, maximizing the profits we can send out to our shareholders, and really just bringing in as many customers as we can on a given day. So at the end of the day, we want to show we grew profits by 150%, year to year. You might say, well, I think that we would really garner a lot of goodwill and respect in our community if we can pay 30% above minimum wage for our wait staff,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
Or if we can say we are donating a portion of our profits to local food banks, right? Or we are devoting a portion of our chef's time to producing meals for local soup kitchens. You and I have very different views on what is in the best interests of the company at that point, but we have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the company. That is where I would say the law is, I wouldn't say less helpful, because I'm a lawyer, but I would say it's there is more scope for argument, and the law is going to provide less of a prescriptive guide for us, because we're really getting into sort of normative questions around, what is the company and what purpose does it serve?
You and I, in our pre-show discussions, you had mentioned Milton Friedman and social responsibility. This case seems to sort of fit the bill.
Yeah.
How do we talk about it given Friedman's sort of, we're going back to the 1970s for this thing.
Yes.
But it's held fast as a way of going about business.
Yes, absolutely. So, Milton Friedman, famous economist, the University of Chicago School of Economics, he came out with an article, and I think it was right around 1970, right at the start of the 70s, that said that it didn't just say a corporation's sole responsibility is to maximize profits for its shareholders. He actually went so far as to say a corporation's social responsibility is to maximize profits for its shareholders, right? Yep. So this was this prime example of this narrow view of when you form a for-profit corporation, all other factors aside, the only thing that you as a fiduciary of that corporation need to do, if you're on the board of directors or if you're a manager, is act in ways that will maximize the shareholders' profits, right? Very narrow view, and that prevailed throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the early 2000s, really. And this is an interesting example of an area in which the corporate laws reflect and can evolve in response to changing economic and social expectations. So what I mean is, now you and I have been talking about how the law is evolving, and there might be arguments that we as directors of our restaurant could say, look, we're going to cut into the shareholders' dividends a little bit this year because we want to give back to our employees, or we want to give back to our community. We might do that, A, because we think that that is the purpose of a company, to benefit a broad variety of constituencies beyond its shareholders. Or we might do it, B, because we're self-interested in thinking, well, actually, if we do this, we're going to get a lot of goodwill. We're going to get more customers in here. We're going to be able to jack up prices next year. We're going to go gangbusters, right? It doesn't really matter what our motives are, but the fact that you and I could have that debate and make those decisions reflects a real sea change. We would not have had this discussion in the 70s and 80s. It just wouldn't have even been a question. And now the corporate laws, and we can talk about sort of a couple of doctrines that have arisen under Delaware corporate law, but the how we are interpreting the laws is really changing to accommodate these sort of this social expectation and social demand that companies do more than just serve the economic interests of their owners. So these fiduciary duties that we've been talking about, they were the same back in the era of Milton Friedman. That hasn't changed. The Delaware courts, though, have evolved new ways of looking at and analyzing these fiduciary duties that reflect societal expectations. So how those laws are interpreted has changed dramatically in 50 years.
What about legal developments around environmental or social impact? How does it figure into everything that we're talking about? It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. And that's an area where I'm going to also just say stay tuned because, I think you could get 10 corporate lawyers in this room and they would all give a slightly different answer on where we're going. So I think broadly speaking, we can all say, yes, there is some scope for for-profit companies to take into account their environmental impact, for example. Now, does that mean that we can invest in 25% more expensive recycled packaging for our products when we send them out? I don't know. We'd have to do, or could we say, no, we can only invest in 15% more expensive recycled packaging, right?
Yes.
There's going to be complicated questions here, and we're going to think about what would the impact on our company's financials be? What would the impact be on the company's value more broadly, meaning social perceptions of our company?
Sure.
What types of goodwill will we get? Will investors want to invest in our company because of our environmental record? Or will they stay away because we have a poor environmental record, right? Mm-hmm. So this is what I was saying earlier, where when we're thinking about how directors and managers fulfill their fiduciary duties, the picture has become a lot more complicated and a lot messier. Potentially, we're doing the right thing and moving in the right direction here.
Yeah.
But we're introducing a lot more noise into the system.
Right. And we've got customer demand that is changing shape.
Exactly.
That's kind of the thing, right?
Exactly.
It will all go back to that.
Yes.
Customer expectations of what they expect of a company that they do business with, that they buy from.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Big part of it. A couple questions coming in from the audience. Yeah. I think this one's compelling. It's not necessarily directed to what we're talking about at the moment, but Karima and Mariama and Arthur Esquire check in. Can you speak to the key challenges around developing CEO compensation packages, succession planning? We were talking about strategy around maybe paying a little bit more than minimum wage on the bottom side.
Right.
What about the top? How are people thinking about CEO compensation these days?
Right. Yes, and this is an area that really came to the fore around the time actually that I was starting in law practice.
Okay.
So I started around the mid 2000s, and at that point, Americans in particular, and this has been reflected internationally, but in particular Americans were starting to focus on massive pay packages that CEOs of large publicly listed companies
they were absurd.
Getting.
Yeah,
exactly. In response to some of the big accounting scandals that we saw in this country, you think of WorldCom and Enron, the Securities and Exchange Commission evolved many of its rules around corporate disclosures, intended to force companies to be more forthright and honest and allow investors to really make more informed decisions about the companies. One of the ways in which the rules changed was around executive compensation. So the SEC said, all right, no, for your top compensated people, you have to give hard dollar sums. You need to tell us exactly what they are getting, what they're getting in cash, what they're getting in equity, and you're going to need to justify that. So this was an example of the laws evolving in response to a moment of sort of social and economic crisis with some of these accounting scandals coming out.
Yep. And
the laws forcing companies to change how they communicated to their shareholders, one of the most important constituencies that we've been talking about. As a result, there was a whole industry of executive compensation lawyers and analysts and consultants who were brought in to advise a company specifically and say, this is what you can pay. We've benchmarked it against your top 20 competitors, and this is how you can justify it to your shareholders.
Sure. Right.
Now, this is an example of conflicts of interest that might come up in a corporation. So, I'm running our ice cream factory. Sure, I want the ice cream factory to do well. I might also want to, renovate my bathroom at home or, send my kids to college, whatever it might be. My economic interests are both aligned with the company and separate from the company, right? And so who do I need to delegate to make decisions about how I'm going to be compensated? It will be the board of directors usually that will be deciding that. How do we know and how do the shareholders know that the board of directors are thinking purely about the benefits to the company rather than having some sort of a side deal with me or being sympathetic to me, right? Whatever it might be.
So are corporate directors or officers actually ever really held legally accountable for complying with their fiduciary duty, or is it theoretical? Yeah. Is it a combination of the two? What's the deal?
Yeah, so that's another area where this is changing. I think for a long time, fiduciary duties were considered a bit more theoretical. There wasn't as much accountability, absent an extreme example of a director or officer that was acting purely in their self-interest, right? But when the idea was simply you make decisions to maximize profits for the shareholders and that's it was kind of straightforward. So WeWork, many of you know the story of WeWork, and Adam Newman. Yeah. The sort of disgraced founder from WeWork. WeWork, many of you know about sort of the failed IPO, the circumstances surrounding Adam Newman's departure. But beyond the headlines, what was really at the core of the claims against Adam Newman and then some claims that he made in return were fiduciary duties.
Yeah.
So, Adam Newman, broad visionary, again, we don't need to necessarily argue about what his intentions were.
Sure.
But the claims were made that Adam neglected his fiduciary duties as both CEO and a director of WeWork by spending money frivolously, in many cases spending money that benefited him as an individual, by mismanaging the company's IPO so badly that it resulted in pretty spectacularly disastrous public relations issue for the company. So a group of shareholders brought a class action lawsuit against Adam Newman, specifically saying you violated your fiduciary duties of both care and loyalty to the company with your mismanagement and your actions. Adam Newman then, in turn, brought a lawsuit against SoftBank, the Japanese bank that had taken a large stake in WeWork. SoftBank sat on WeWork's board of directors, so they had a fiduciary duty to WeWork. SoftBank had put out a tender offer to acquire WeWork, and they withdrew that offer. And Adam Newman said, no, because you were on our board, you had a fiduciary duty, you needed to follow through on the tender offer. So it's two sets of litigation coming out of a company that had suffered economically and in terms of public relations. Kind of, it was an embarrassing situation, to say the least. And at the essence, the legal claims at the bottom of that embarrassing situation were all around which fiduciaries had done what and whether they had violated their fiduciary duties. So again, I think this is the type of thing that we're going to be seeing more because, as we've said, there is now more scope for argumentation and potentially disagreement around how directors and officers should fulfill their fiduciary duties, now that we have this broader view of what a corporation's purpose is. So when there's a broader view, there's potential for dissension, there's potential for argument. We probably are going to be seeing more, if not litigation, at least public airing of disagreements about how directors and officers are acting and whether they're acting in compliance with their fiduciary duties.
To turn to the seismically absurd, we chatted about Elon Musk,
Sure.
Head honcho at Tesla, now Twitter. What's going on? Where's the snag for him from a fiduciary standpoint, right? There's all this he makes shareholders crazy, right?
Sure.
Via his tweets, as it turns out, at Tesla. So what's the situation there? How do we all kind of understand it.
Yeah.
How do you think about this?
Well, I think instead of saying where is the snag, I think we might say where is there not a snag, because there's so many of them in here.
Okay.
But yes, no, you're absolutely right. So taking a step back, so when you had Elon Musk simply running Tesla as a primary shareholder, director, CEO, his interests were represented on many, many levels. Obviously, there's an opportunity for conflict of interest. Then Twitter came in. And then there was the question of how he was using Twitter, and many cases, observers asking, is he using Twitter in a way that violates his fiduciary duties by either giving away confidential information about the business, sensitive information, or by torpedoing the business, right? So there's all sorts of questions there that relate to fiduciary duties, securities laws. I think we're going to be unpacking that for years, right? And it's kind of an interesting example. That being said, I was thinking about this the other day in a less absurd, but I think potentially more valuable example of fiduciary duties. There was an article a couple days ago in the New York Times about the pickup truck that Tesla's been developing that we've all been hearing about for years, but we haven't seen it yet. It's delayed in production, but now Tesla just announced in its most recent earnings announcement that they're going to be starting production this year on the truck. So everybody's wondering, what's this truck going to look like? What's it going to be? Is it going to be a success? So there was an article talking about how, and I'm not an engineering expert, so I'm going to mangle this a little bit.
Go ahead.
But the frame of the vehicle is stainless steel. They're calling it the exoskeleton. Stainless steel, you would think of fabulous. That sounds great. Sounds really durable. Sounds safe. Sure, but there's lots of engineering challenges associated with it. So stainless steel is more expensive to source than the type of steel used in most car manufacturing, and it's a lot more cumbersome and expensive to mold into shape. That's how my layperson's explanation for how you build a car. You mold it into shape, right?
Sounds great.
So there's a lot of questions out there. This could be the future of car making if Tesla is able to successfully manufacture in mass numbers and bring this product out to market. It could be, though, what some people are saying is Elon Musk just chasing this idea because he thinks it's fun, or because he thinks, oh, well, let me play around with it and see if I can do what nobody else has done, or because it's him and it's just kind of like, let me be the center of the story, right? I'm not saying any of those things are happening, but there are observers who are worrying that he has set Tesla up with a car that is expensive to manufacture, extremely slow to manufacture. In the meantime, Ford is selling out the F-150s, can't even keep up
And
with
those
demand.
Mavericks that are coming up too.
Exactly.
The $25,000 cars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those are all flooding the market.
Absolutely.
And Tesla's pickup truck is nowhere to be seen and probably won't be for a while.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting one. Is Elon Musk, in making these engineering decisions about what the pickup truck is going to look like, is he complying with his fiduciary duties to act in the best interests of Tesla? Or is he pursuing a separate personal agenda? I'm not sure we'll ever know the answer, but right now, that's, for me, kind of an area that I would watch as we're thinking about fiduciary duties.
Celia Bigoness, always a pleasure to have you in the studio. That hour flew by like it always does. I want to bring Molly back in if she's around while I ask the audience really quickly to give us some feedback. So typically what we do at the end of these, or oftentimes, what we do at the end of these is ask you how we did, right? So I'm looking for up to a 5-star rating. Let us know how we did. We'll follow this quick question with a little bit more feedback. I'm really interested to know how we did as far as meeting your expectations with today's keynote. Did you learn something? Were there takeaways? And even more importantly, things that you wish we discussed or things that we failed to discuss that may have been very important to the conversation, or just simple tips and observations and tricks. Not tricks, observations and tips, please. So give us your feedback. Audience, thank you so much. These are great questions that came in. Mary, Tina, Tanya, Ashani, sorry we didn't get to your questions. Thanks for everybody else that submitted. We will see you next time on Keynotes. Thank you and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.